The night Julian Hawthorne brought his fiancée to his ex's gala, the cruelest people in Manhattan expected her to be embarrassed. But before midnight, every one of them would be too ashamed to speak. The St. Aurelia Hotel rose over Fifth Avenue like a monument to old money. All limestone arches, gold doors, and windows glowing against the cold New York night. Outside, photographers shouted names into the flash of cameras. Inside, champagne moved across silver trays, violin music floated beneath crystal chandeliers, and the wealthiest guests in the city smiled as if kindness were another accessory they had rented for the evening. Julian Hawthorne stepped through the entrance in a midnight tuxedo, calm, elegant, untouchable. At 35, he was the white billionaire chief executive officer of Hawthorne Capital, the kind of man whose name opened doors before he reached for the handle. He had inherited power, multiplied it, and learned to wear silence like armor. But tonight, for the first time in years, his hand tightened with uncertainty around someone else's. Clara Whitfield walked beside him in a navy gown that was simple enough to offend people who believed money should always announce itself. She was 28, white, soft-faced, clear-eyed, with small pearl earrings from her mother and a posture that did not beg for approval. She had not been raised in rooms like this. She knew that. Everyone else knew it too. The difference was that Clara had stopped apologizing for it long before she met Julian. Still, as the cameras turned toward her, she felt the room measuring her in quiet inches. The dress not expensive enough, the jewelry too modest, the last name too ordinary, the smile too sincere. Julian leaned closer. "You are doing fine." Clara glanced at him. "That is what people say before something goes badly." He gave a faint smile, but his eyes moved across the ballroom until they found Vivian Cross. She stood beneath the largest chandelier in a silver gown. Blonde hair swept smooth, red lips curved with the patience of a woman who had already decided how the night should end. Vivian was Julian's former fiancée, though no one said that word too loudly anymore. In public, she was the chair of the Cross Foundation Gala, a beloved philanthropist, a woman born into privilege and trained to make cruelty sound like etiquette. When she saw Julian, she opened her arms as if the entire gala had been waiting for him. "Julian," she said, kissing the air near his cheek a little too slowly for the cameras. "You came. You invited us," he replied. Clara heard the small emphasis on us and appreciated it. But appreciation did not erase the way Vivian's hand lingered on his sleeve. Vivian turned toward Clara with a smile bright enough to cut glass. "And Clara, how brave of you to come. Most women would be intimidated by a room they were never raised to enter." The nearest guests laughed softly, not loud enough to be vulgar, just enough to be cruel. Julian's face tightened. "Vivian." The warning in his voice was low, but Clara heard what he did not say after it. He did not say, "Apologize." He did not say, "That was unacceptable." He did not say, "Do not speak to the woman I love that way." He only said her name, as if old history deserved better manners than present pain. Clara looked at Vivian and smiled politely. "I have found that rooms are rarely intimidating. People try to be." A small silence opened around them. Vivian's eyes cooled for half a second, then warmed again for the photographers. Wonderful. Sharp. Julian always did admire surprises. She guided them toward the ballroom before Clara could answer. The gala was beautiful in the way a locked jewelry case was beautiful. White roses climbed gold columns. A stage stood at the far end, framed by velvet curtains and two large screens showing images of smiling children, rebuilt community centers, and donation totals climbing in elegant numbers. At the center of the presentation was the Cross Relief Initiative, supposedly raising money for schools, shelters, and emergency housing across New York. Clara's eyes lingered on the numbers longer than the flowers. Before her engagement to Julian, before society pages reduced her to his unlikely fiancé, she had worked in compliance for a nonprofit that lost funding because of vendor irregularities no one wanted to discuss until it was too late. She had learned that dishonesty usually wore clean fonts, impressive logos, and phrases like administrative partnership. Julian touched her elbow. "You went quiet." "I am reading." "At a gala?" "Especially at a gala." He followed her gaze to the screen. "It is just the donation deck." "Nothing is ever just a deck when people are asking for money." Before he could respond, Vivian appeared again, this time with a tall man in a black tuxedo and a narrow smile. "Clara, this is Malcolm Pierce, director of the foundation. Malcolm keeps all of us honest." Malcolm took Clara's hand briefly. His palm was cool, his expression practiced. "A pleasure. I hear you have a background in nonprofit work." "Compliance," Clara said. "How useful." Vivian's tone made the word sound like a household tool. "Then you must be thrilled to attend an event where professionals handle the complicated parts." Clara did not blink. Professionals are usually the reason compliance exists. Julian looked at her then, a flash of surprise and pride crossing his face. But Vivian laughed, drawing the circle wider, pulling more guests into the moment. "She is refreshingly simple, is she not?" The phrase landed with perfect softness, and the guests around them accepted it exactly as intended. Simple, not elegant, not powerful, not one of them. Clara felt the heat rise behind her collarbone, but she kept her hands still. Her mother had taught her that dignity was not silence. It was choosing the right moment to speak so the truth would not have to repeat itself. Across the room, the screens shifted to a donor list. Names moved slowly upward in gold letters. Hawthorne Capital appeared near the top, followed by Cross Foundation partners, then several corporate sponsors. Clara's attention snagged on one line near the bottom. Pierce Relief Fund. The name was small, almost hidden between larger donors, but something about it pulled her out of the noise. Pierce Relief Fund. She had seen a similar vendor structure before, years earlier, buried in a file that ruined a community program and cost families the help they had been promised. Her smile faded. The room kept laughing around her. Vivian kept talking. Julian kept trying to be polite. But Clara was no longer listening to any of them. She was watching the screen, counting numbers, following vendor names, feeling an old pattern rise from beneath polished charity language. Then the donation total jumped by an amount that did not match the pledge list below it. Clara's eyes narrowed. The entire room thought she had been brought there to be judged. But as the chandeliers glittered above every cruel smile, Clara realized something no one else had noticed. This gala was not only a trap for her. It was hiding one of its own. 3 weeks before Clara Whitfield stood beneath the chandeliers of the St. Aurelia Hotel and saw the first wrong number on Vivian Cross's donor screen, she was standing in Julian Hawthorne's penthouse kitchen at 7 in the morning, trying to decide whether a billionaire owned a normal toaster. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower overlooking Central Park, with white marble counters, silent appliances, and windows tall enough to make the city look like a painting someone had paid too much to frame. Clara wore jeans, a cream sweater, and the small pearl earrings her mother had given her when she left Ohio for New York. Julian stood near the espresso machine in a navy suit, reading 3 messages at once, looking like the kind of man who could buy a company before breakfast and forget where the mugs were kept. "Do you have bread?" Clara asked. Julian looked up as if she had asked for a rare mineral. "I believe so." "You believe so? There is a chef. There is also a kitchen." He glanced around the room, caught between amusement and embarrassment. Clara opened 2 cabinets before finding a loaf of sourdough wrapped in paper. Found it. Crisis avoided. Julian set down his phone and watched her slide bread into the toaster. It was one of the things he loved most about her, how she moved through wealth without worshipping it. She noticed beauty, yes, but she did not bow to it. She thanked his driver by name. She asked the building doorman about his daughter's college applications. She carried grocery coupons in the same purse that now appeared in society magazines beside his arm. To Julian, she was the first honest thing that had happened in a life built under chandeliers. To his world, she was a question mark wearing his ring. That morning, a gossip column had called her the modest mystery fiancée of Hawthorne Capital's Golden Chief Executive Officer. Another headline was less polite. Can a middle-class bride survive old New York? Clara had read it while brushing her teeth and said nothing until Julian found her folding the newspaper into a perfect square. "I can have our legal team call them," he said. She laughed once, not happily. "For what? Calling me middle class? That is not defamation. That is my tax history. They are being cruel. They are being predictable." Julian hated how calm she sounded. He was used to problems he could solve with signatures, lawyers, wire transfers, private security, and the weight of the Hawthorne name. But Clara's problem was not that doors stayed closed. It was that doors opened and everyone inside acted like she should be grateful for the insult. At 10, they attended a foundation planning meeting in the lower office library, a room filled with old leather books no one had opened in years. Julian sat at the head of the table. Clara sat beside him, not because she wanted to look powerful, but because he had asked her to review some charity governance documents after she quietly noticed duplicated vendor language in a school grant proposal the week before. She had once worked compliance for a nonprofit that funded housing, after leaving teaching for steadier pay and better health insurance. She knew how good causes could be used as pretty curtains for ugly math. Across the table, 2 trustees spoke over her 3 times. One explained donor restrictions as if Clara had never seen a budget. Another asked whether she was comfortable with nonprofit terminology. Clara smiled, opened the binder, and corrected a restricted fund classification they had missed. The room went still. Julian looked proud. Clara looked tired. After the meeting, in the elevator, he touched her hand. "You were brilliant. That is not the part that bothers me." "What is?" "That they needed me to be brilliant before they considered being respectful." Julian did not answer quickly enough. He wanted to defend her, but he also wanted to believe his world was not as small and polished as she saw it. His silence told her that loving her and understanding her were not always the same thing. That afternoon, the invitation arrived. Heavy cream paper, silver lettering. The Cross Foundation Gala at the St. Aurelia Hotel, hosted by Vivian Cross. Clara found it on the console table beside a vase of white orchids, propped upright like an old ghost that knew where it belonged. Julian came in from a call and stopped when he saw it in her hand. For 1 second, the practiced calm left his face. "Vivian sent that personally," Clara said. "Apparently we are honored guests. We do not have to go. Do you want to go?" He loosened his tie, buying time. "It is a major charity event. Hawthorne Capital has been a donor for years." "That was not my question." Julian crossed to the window. Below them, Manhattan moved in bright, confident lines, indifferent to every old wound above it. "Vivian and I ended a long time ago. I know. I want people to see that. I want them to see us." Clara set the invitation down. "Us? Or your proof that you moved on?" He turned back, stung because the question was too accurate. "That is not fair." "Maybe not, but it is honest." The room quieted. Julian looked at the ring on her hand, then at her face. He had given her the diamond in a private garden behind a museum, not in front of cameras, because Clara had once told him she hated being made into a spectacle. Yet somehow, since the engagement, his world had turned her into one anyway. "I will be with you the entire night," he said. "That is not the same as protecting me. It is a gala, Clara, not a battlefield." She looked at him gently then, almost sadly. "That is how I know you have never entered a room where everyone was trained to cut without leaving marks." Julian stepped closer. "Tell me what you need." Clara picked up the invitation again and ran her thumb over Vivian's embossed name. "Do not bring me into a room just to leave me alone in it." He held her gaze. I will not. She wanted to believe him. Part of her did. But part of her remembered every polite smile that had treated her like a temporary mistake. She looked past him at the city, then back at the name cross shining in silver ink. And Julian, she said quietly. A ring does not protect a woman in a room where everyone is waiting for her to bleed politely. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Neither of them knew yet that the gala would test more than their engagement. It would test whether Julian knew where to stand before the room decided Clara was someone worth standing beside. The invitation had barely crossed Clara's hands before Vivian Cross began turning the gala into a stage built for one purpose: to make Julian Hawthorne regret bringing another woman into a room she still considered hers. At the Cross Foundation office on Park Avenue, the planning suite looked like charity from a distance and strategy from up close. White orchids lined the conference table. Champagne-colored folders sat in perfect stacks. A digital seating chart glowed on the wall, each guest name placed with the precision of a chess piece. Vivian stood before it in a cream silk blouse and pearl earrings that cost more than most people's rent, tapping one manicured finger against Clara Whitfield's name. Move her here, she said. Her assistant glanced at the screen. Between Mrs. Langford and the Westlake sisters? Exactly. The assistant hesitated. They can be difficult. Vivian smiled. They are useful. She moved Julian's name one seat away, close enough for the cameras to capture him with Clara, far enough for conversation to separate them whenever Vivian needed it to. Then she placed herself across from Clara, where every reaction could be observed, measured, and sharpened. And make sure the society photographer knows this is Julian's first major appearance with his new fiancée. She let the word new linger like a stain on clean linen. We want warmth. We want contrast. In Vivian's world, contrast meant one woman raised in old money and another woman invited to prove she could survive it. Across the table, Malcolm Pierce adjusted his glasses and watched the seating chart with polite amusement. As director of the foundation, he looked like every trustworthy man old money preferred. Gray hair, calm voice, tailored tuxedos, and a talent for making numbers sound noble. The gala program lay open before him, showing the auction schedule, donor tiers, vendor payments, and the final presentation deck. Vivian turned to him. The Hawthorne Cross painting stays last. Malcolm looked up. Are you certain? That piece has history. That is the point. The painting had once hung in the private gallery Julian and Vivian planned to build together before their engagement collapsed. It was tasteful, expensive, and heavy with the kind of past that could embarrass a future bride without anyone ever saying the word jealousy. Vivian imagined Clara on stage beside it, forced to smile while guests remembered who stood beside Julian first. We will ask Clara to assist with the final auction introduction, Vivian said. A sweet gesture. Inclusive. Malcolm's mouth twitched. And uncomfortable. Only if she understands what she is standing beside. Vivian turned back to the program. She will. Malcolm closed one folder and slid another beneath it, but not before Vivian caught sight of a vendor list with several names she had seen too often. Pierce Relief Fund, Northline Community Logistics, Harbor Renewal Services. She did not ask questions because she preferred charity the way she preferred loyalty, polished on the surface and obedient underneath. But she was not foolish. She knew Malcolm moved money through structures too complicated for dinner guests to challenge. She also knew the foundation's public image had never looked better. Smiling children on screens, restored shelters in glossy photos, scholarship numbers that made donors feel moral before dessert. If some administrative costs wandered into shadows, Vivian considered that Malcolm's problem, not hers, as long as the chandeliers stayed lit and her name remained clean. The donation deck, she said. Keep it elegant. No clutter. Clara apparently worked in compliance, so do not give her a playground. Malcolm gave a low laugh. Compliance in a modest nonprofit is not the same as understanding major philanthropic finance. Still, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing slightly, hide the seams. Malcolm's smile faded for the briefest moment. There are no seams. There are always seams, Malcolm. That is why people like you have jobs. He accepted the insult because it came from the woman whose gala protected him. After the meeting, Vivian walked alone through the St. Aurelia ballroom, while workers tested lighting and florists assembled towers of white roses. The hotel staff moved quickly, quietly, trained to recognize power by the softness of its demands. Vivian paused beneath the central chandelier and imagined the night unfolding. Julian entering with Clara, cameras flashing. Clara noticing the room notice her. The Westlake sisters asking where she summered. Mrs. Langford discussing old families as if breeding were a credential. Vivian stepping close to Julian for one photograph too many. Then the auction, the painting, the sweet little public reminder that Clara's ring did not erase Vivian's history. Her phone buzzed. A message from a society editor appeared. Is the new fiancé ready for Old New York? Vivian typed back, we will find out. 2 days later, Clara received a call from the gala wardrobe coordinator, a woman with a bright voice and no warmth. The suggested palette is champagne, ivory, and silver, the woman said. Clara looked down at the invitation, where the dress code simply read formal evening attire. That is not on the card. It is an internal note for visual harmony. Interesting, Clara said. I was planning to wear navy. Pause. Navy may photograph rather heavy against the decor. Then I will be easy to find. Julian watched her from across the penthouse living room, concern moving across his face. When she ended the call, he asked, problem? Clara set the phone down. No, just someone politely explaining that I might ruin the furniture by standing near it. He frowned. Vivian's team should not be calling you about color. They are not calling about color. They are calling about obedience. Julian came to sit beside her. I can handle Vivian. Clara looked at him carefully. Can you? The question made him go still. He wanted to say yes immediately, but Clara had learned that a late defense sometimes arrived dressed as love and still left the wound untreated. Julian touched her hand. I will not let her hurt you. Clara wanted to believe him again. She always wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part of loving a powerful man who thought harm had to be loud before it counted. Meanwhile, across town, Malcolm Pierce sat in his office long after dark, reviewing the donation deck line by line. He removed one vendor breakdown, merged 3 payments under a broader administrative category, and renamed Pierce Relief Fund as PRF Community Support in the visual presentation. It looked cleaner that way, safer, almost invisible. Before closing the file, he noticed an old audit note attached to a vendor account from years earlier, a note created by a compliance officer at a small nonprofit that had once raised questions about Northline community logistics. The officer's name was Clara Whitfield. Malcolm stared at it. Then he called Vivian. Your guest may be more inconvenient than expected, he said. Vivian stood in her dressing room, trying on diamond earrings for the gala, and smiled at her reflection. Then we make sure she is too humiliated to look closely. But by hiding the truth inside the same room where they planned to shame her, Vivian and Malcolm had made one fatal mistake. They had mistaken Clara's quietness for weakness, when quiet was exactly how she listened before finding the lie. On the evening of the gala, Clara Whitfield stood in front of the mirror in Julian Hawthorne's penthouse and fastened her mother's pearl earrings with hands that were steady only because she refused to let them be anything else. The navy gown fell cleanly over her shoulders, elegant but quiet, the exact opposite of the champagne and silver palette Vivian's team had tried to push on her. Behind Clara, Manhattan glowed through the glass walls, all headlights and towers and winter haze, a city that could make anyone feel small if they mistook height for worth. Julian watched from the doorway in a black tuxedo, his cuff links still undone, his expression softer than the room deserved. You look beautiful, he said. Clara met his eyes in the mirror. That is not what I am worried about. He crossed to her slowly. I know. Do you? She turned around, and the question sat between them with more weight than the diamond on her hand. Julian took a breath. I know Vivian can be difficult. Clara gave him a small, sad smile. Difficult is when a subway delay makes you late. Vivian is intentional. He looked down, accepting the correction because he could not honestly reject it. Clara stepped closer and fixed one of his cuff links, not because he needed help, but because touch sometimes made hard conversations less sharp. I am not asking you to fight every person who dislikes me, she said. I am asking you to notice the moment politeness becomes cruelty. Julian covered her hand with his. I will. She wanted to believe that promise. She wanted to walk into the Saint Aurelia with him and feel his words become action. But part of her had already learned that powerful men often confused standing nearby with standing up. 30 minutes later, the car rolled to a stop beneath the hotel's gold awning. Camera flashes burst against the windows before the door even opened. Julian stepped out first, calm and practiced, then turned back and offered Clara his hand. The photographers called his name, then hers, though many said it with curiosity instead of respect. Clara, over here. Show the ring. Julian, is Vivian expecting you? Clara felt that last question like cold air under fabric, but she kept her face composed. Julian's hand tightened around hers. That helped. Not enough, but it helped. Inside, the hotel smelled of white roses, polished wood, and expensive perfume. The ballroom doors opened onto a world built to impress itself. Crystal chandeliers, ivory tablecloths, gold chairs, tall floral arrangements, and 2 massive screens glowing with the Cross Foundation logo. A string quartet played near the staircase while servers moved through the crowd with champagne flutes arranged like fragile trophies. Clara did not reach for one. Her eyes moved instead to the screens, the sponsor wall, the program cards, the donor tiers printed near the check-in table. Julian leaned close. You are reading again. You brought a compliance woman to a charity gala, she murmured. This is what happens. He smiled, but before he could answer, Vivian Cross appeared as if summoned by the flash of a camera. Silver gown, diamond bracelet, perfect posture. The kind of smile that had never apologized in its life. Julian, she said, opening her arms. He accepted the greeting, but when Vivian held him half a second too long, Clara saw the cameras catch it. Julian stepped back, yet not as quickly as he should have. Vivian turned to Clara. Navy. How unexpected. Clara touched one pearl earring lightly. It was my first choice. I admire that. Some women dress to belong. Others dress to be remembered. The words sounded like praise only if a person did not understand tone. Clara smiled. And some women mistake color coordination for character. Julian's mouth tightened, half alarm, half admiration. Vivian's eyes cooled, then brightened again as a group of guests approached. Everyone, you remember Julian, of course. And this is Clara Whitfield. She paused just long enough before adding, his fiancée. The pause did what Vivian wanted. It invited the guests to study Clara as if Julian's choice required evidence. Mrs. Langford, white-haired and diamond-covered, extended 2 fingers instead of a full hand. How lovely. Julian always did enjoy surprises. One of the Westlake sisters tilted her head. Were you in finance, dear? Non-profit compliance, Clara said. Before that, teaching. How sweet. The word sweet arrived wrapped in velvet and filled with needles. Julian shifted beside her, beginning to hear it now, but still late. Clara has saved organizations from mistakes people with much larger offices missed, he said. Clara appreciated the defense, but she also felt the shape of it. He was offering credentials to people who should have offered respect without requiring them. Vivian touched his arm. Still protective. That has not changed. Clara watched Julian glance at Vivian's hand, then politely remove his arm. Better, Clara thought. Late but better. Malcolm Pierce approached with 2 board members and a smile polished thin. Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Whitfield, thank you for being here. Hawthorne Capital's gift anchors tonight's housing initiative. Then the housing initiative should be easy to explain, Clara said. Malcolm's smile paused. Of course. Good. I always like when numbers and purpose walk in the same direction. A board member laughed uncertainly. Vivian stepped in. Clara is very interested in the details. It is refreshing. There it was again, refreshing, the softer cousin of simple. Clara turned her eyes toward the donor screen as the presentation shifted to pledge totals. Hawthorne Capital stood near the top. Cross Foundation partners below it. Then smaller PRF community support. The initials touched an old memory. She looked down at the printed program, then back at the screen. The total had risen again, but the listed pledges had not changed enough to explain the jump. Could have been timing. Could have been a delayed update. Could have been nothing. But Clara had spent years learning that nothing was often where bad numbers like to hide. Julian followed her gaze. What is wrong? He asked quietly. Clara did not answer right away. Across the room, Malcolm was already watching her too closely, and Vivian was smiling as if the evening belonged to her. Clara slipped the program into her clutch, folded once at the page with the vendor names. Maybe nothing, she said. But if it is something, they brought it into the wrong room. Before Julian could ask what she meant, a bell chimed for dinner, and Vivian lifted her glass toward Clara from across the ballroom, inviting her to the table where every cruel guest had been carefully placed. The dinner table at the St. Aurelia was arranged like a beautiful trap, and Clara knew it the moment she found her name card placed between Mrs. Langford and the Westlake sisters, with Julian seated close enough to see her but not close enough to rescue every pause. White roses towered above the centerpieces. Gold flatware gleamed beside crystal glasses. The menu was printed on thick ivory paper, each course described with words longer than the portions. Across the table, Vivian Cross sat beneath the chandelier as if the light belonged to her personally. Malcolm Pierce was 2 seats down, speaking softly to a donor while his eyes kept sliding toward Clara's clutch, where the folded program rested like a secret waiting to breathe. Julian leaned toward Clara before sitting. Are you all right? He asked. She looked at the distance between their chairs, then back at him. Ask me after dessert. He wanted to move his place card. She saw the thought cross his face, but Vivian was already lifting her glass, calling the room to attention, thanking donors, praising legacy, and speaking about service with the polished rhythm of someone who had never had to wonder whether help would arrive in time. Clara listened. She always listened before speaking. That was how she caught the first small mistake. Vivian mentioned a housing initiative amount that did not match the total shown earlier on the screen. Not by much, just enough to make Clara's attention sharpen. Mrs. Langford turned toward her with a smile that had been sharpened over decades of charity luncheons. So, Clara, Julian tells us you worked in nonprofit compliance. How practical. It was useful work, Clara said. People depended on it. How admirable. And before that, teaching? Asked one of the Westlake sisters. Elementary school. Sweet, the other said, as if Clara had admitted to collecting teacups. Such a different world from Hawthorne Capital. Clara placed her napkin in her lap. Most worlds are different when you actually meet the people living in them. The first sister blinked. Julian heard that. Clara saw his eyes lift from across the table. Alert now. But the questions kept coming, soft as silk, pointed as pins. Did she find Manhattan society overwhelming? Had she hired a stylist since the engagement? Was her family excited by all the changes? Did she know which foundations were considered serious and which were more local? Each question pretended to be interest. Each answer was expected to shrink her. Clara refused to shrink. My family is excited that I am loved well, she said. Not that the chairs are expensive. Vivian smiled into her wineglass. That is charming. Though one does hope love comes with some preparation. Julian's world can be demanding. Clara looked at her. So can real life. A quiet laugh moved around the table, uncertain this time, not sure whether it had permission. Julian shifted in his seat. Clara has more preparation than most people in this room would guess, he said. Mrs. Langford tilted her head. Of course, dear. No one is suggesting otherwise. But she was. They all were. That was the special cruelty of rooms like this. Nothing had to be said directly because everyone understood the angle of the knife. A server placed the next course in front of them. Clara thanked him by name after reading his badge. Vivian noticed and gave a tiny smile, as if kindness to staff confirmed Clara's lower station rather than exposing the emptiness of everyone else's manners. Malcolm leaned forward. Miss Whitfield, since you appreciate details, I hope tonight's presentation meets your standards. I hope it meets the community's needs, Clara replied. Those are not always the same thing. Malcolm's hand paused near his glass. Julian caught it. For the first time that night, his attention moved away from Vivian's social choreography and toward the current under the table. Clara was not merely enduring the room. She was reading it. The Westlake sister on Clara's right smiled again. I must ask, does it feel strange? Standing beside someone like Julian after such an ordinary life. The table quieted because this was what they had been circling all night. Julian started to rise. Enough. Clara lifted one hand without looking at him. Not because she did not want his support, but because she would not let them believe she needed a man's voice to make her own worthy of hearing. She set her fork down with a soft click. Then she looked around the table, calm and direct. You keep mistaking inheritance for intelligence. That must be exhausting. No one moved. Even the string quartet across the ballroom seemed to fade beneath the silence. Clara continued, her voice low enough to make them lean in and clear enough to make them regret it. You ask where I went to school because you think education begins with a name on a building. You ask about stylists because you think dignity needs tailoring. You ask whether I belong beside Julian because you believe love should apply for approval from people who confuse wealth with worth. Vivian's smile was gone now. Julian stared at Clara with something like awe and something like shame, because she had explained in 30 seconds what he had failed to understand for weeks. Clara turned to Mrs. Langford. I know which fork to use. I also know that manners without kindness are just choreography. A man at the far end lowered his eyes. One of the Westlake sisters flushed. Malcolm adjusted his cuff, but he looked toward the stage, not at Clara. That told her more than his words ever could. Vivian recovered first. What a spirited defense, she said lightly. No wonder Julian is entertained. Julian's chair moved back. This time he stood fully. Do not reduce her to entertainment. The room stilled again. Clara looked at him. Late, yes, but not absent. Vivian's face hardened for only a second before she lifted the gala program. Then let us move to something more meaningful. The final auction item is ready. The screens brightened. On stage, a covered painting waited beneath a white cloth. Clara saw Malcolm's shoulders tense. She saw Vivian glance at Julian, waiting for the past to do its work. And when the certificate image appeared on the screen beside the covered frame, Clara's eyes locked onto the audit stamp in the corner. The stamp was wrong. The audit stamp on the certificate should have been small enough for everyone to ignore, and that was exactly why Clara noticed it. The screen beside the covered painting showed a neat digital image of the ownership document. Donor name, insurance value, appraisal date, foundation transfer record, and at the bottom, a blue verification mark from an outside reviewer. To most guests, it looked official because official things were designed to make wealthy people feel safe from questions. To Clara, it looked like a door with the hinge slightly bent. The stamp was one shade too dark. The date alignment was off by a fraction of an inch. The vendor code beneath it ended in 417, the same ending she remembered from a file she had opened years ago after a youth housing nonprofit lost a grant that should have kept its after-school program alive. Her chest tightened, but her face stayed calm. On stage, Vivian lifted the microphone with perfect grace. For our final auction item, we are honored to present a piece with deep personal history. This painting once belonged to the private Hawthorne Cross collection, acquired during a chapter many of you remember fondly. A soft murmur moved through the room. Clara did not look at Julian, but she felt the table turn toward him. Vivian had chosen the object carefully. Not just expensive, intimate. A polished reminder that before Clara, before the ring, before society began whispering about the schoolteacher and the billionaire, there had been Vivian, standing beside Julian in rooms that never questioned her right to be there. The white cloth was removed. The painting underneath showed a storm over a quiet harbor, dark water and silver light, beautiful in the way expensive sadness often was. Vivian smiled toward Julian. Julian always loved this piece. Julian's jaw tightened. Clara finally glanced at him. He looked uncomfortable, but discomfort was not defense. Vivian turned back to the microphone. And because tonight is about new beginnings, I thought it would be meaningful to invite Clara to help introduce the bidding. The room made a sound too polite to be laughter and too amused to be silence. Julian rose immediately. Vivian, that is unnecessary. Vivian tilted her head. Why? Clara has been so thoughtful tonight. Surely she can say a few words for the foundation. Clara looked at him, then at Vivian, then at Malcolm Pierce, whose expression had gone still in a way that did not match the room. She knew a trap when it wore perfume. If she refused, she would look intimidated. If she accepted, Vivian would make the painting a story about Julian's past, and Clara would become the prop in her own humiliation. But if she went on stage, she would be close enough to read the certificate. Clara stood. Julian caught her hand lightly. You do not have to. She leaned close enough that only he could hear. That is the first true thing anyone has said to me all night. His face changed. She let go and walked toward the stage. Every camera followed. The aisle felt longer than it was. Guests watched her navy dress move between tables of ivory and gold, their eyes full of expectation, waiting for the ordinary fiancé to stumble in extraordinary light. Clara stepped onto the stage beside Vivian and accepted the second microphone. Up close, the painting was even more beautiful, but the certificate resting on the display stand beside it was worse. The paper was real. The frame was real. The numbers were not. Clara saw the vendor code again, PRF 417, tied to a transfer note labeled Conservation Logistics. Her mind moved backward through old files, late nights, highlighted invoices. A community director crying quietly after funding disappeared into administrative correction, fees no one could explain. Northline Community Logistics, Harbor Renewal Services, Pierce Relief Fund, different names, same pattern, split payments, soft language. Money turned sideways until no child, no family, no shelter could follow it back. Vivian smiled beside her. Clara, perhaps you can tell us what it means to support such meaningful work. Clara looked out at the room. Mrs. Langford waited with lifted eyebrows. The Westlake sisters leaned toward each other. Malcolm stood near the stage steps, one hand at his side, the other touching his phone as if he could hold the night together by pressing hard enough. Julian stood by the table now, no longer seated, no longer pretending this was harmless. Clara turned slightly toward the certificate. Meaningful work requires clean records, she said. The room quieted by 1 degree. Vivian's smile remained, but her eyes sharpened. Of course. Clara pointed gently to the screen. This certificate lists PRF Community Support as the logistics partner for conservation transfer. Malcolm stepped forward. That is standard administrative language. Clara looked at him. No, it is familiar administrative language. That is different. A ripple moved through the guests. Vivian laughed softly into her microphone. Clara, darling, perhaps this is not the time for paperwork. It is a charity auction, Clara said. Paperwork is the part that proves the charity is real. Julian's eyes locked on hers. Something in him had finally stopped trying to keep the room comfortable. Malcolm moved closer. Miss Whitfield, the documents have already been reviewed. By whom? Independent partners. Which ones? His smile tightened. This is not a compliance hearing. Clara nodded once. Then it should be easy to answer. The room was silent now. Fully silent. No forks, no whispers, no crystal ringing softly against plates. Vivian lowered her microphone a fraction. You are embarrassing yourself. Clara turned to her, calm as still water. No, I am reading. It was the first time Vivian looked genuinely uncertain. Clara faced the screen again and continued, her voice clear enough for the farthest table to hear. This audit stamp is not consistent with the reviewer format used by any major nonprofit verification office I know. The vendor code matches a structure I have seen before in a closed funding case. The transfer category is vague. The donation total shown earlier does not match the pledge line. And if this painting is being used to raise money for housing, every guest in this room deserves to know whether the paperwork behind it can survive one honest question. Malcolm's face lost color. Vivian stepped toward the technician near the side screen. Take the certificate down. Julian's voice cut across the room before anyone moved. Leave it up. Clara looked at him. For the first time that night, he was not standing near her to look supportive. He was standing with her to make the room answer. Vivian turned slowly. Julian. He did not look away from Clara. If she has a question, we are going to hear it. The technician froze between commands. Malcolm whispered something into his phone. Clara saw the screen begin to flicker, as if someone backstage was trying to change the presentation. Then, for one brief second before it disappeared, the full vendor file flashed open behind her, revealing 3 names Clara knew were never supposed to be seen. Together, Pierce Relief Fund, Northline Community Logistics, and Harbor Renewal Services. The vendor file vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but Clara had already seen enough to know the room had just witnessed the edge of a much larger truth. For half a second, everyone stayed frozen beneath the chandeliers. Vivian with one hand still lifted toward the technician, Malcolm Pierce with his phone pressed uselessly in his palm, Julian standing at the front table with his shoulders squared, and Clara alone on the stage beside a painting that had been chosen to embarrass her, but had instead opened the wrong door. Then the whispers began. Not the soft, cruel whispers from dinner. These were sharper, frightened, practical. Donors leaned toward one another. A trustee reached for his glasses. A reporter near the back lifted her phone higher. Malcolm stepped toward the stage with a controlled smile that looked less convincing under bright light. There seems to be a technical error, he said. The foundation can address documentation questions privately after the auction. Clara looked at him, then at the guests who had spent the evening deciding whether she belonged in the room. Privately is where questions go when people are hoping they disappear. The silence returned, heavier this time. Vivian's face tightened. Clara, this is inappropriate. No, Clara said, her voice calm enough to be more dangerous than anger. Using housing money to decorate reputations would be inappropriate. Asking where that money went is not. Julian moved toward the stage. This time, he did not wait for permission from the room, from Vivian, from the history between them, or from the rules that had kept cruelty polite all evening. He looked at the technician standing stiffly beside the screen. Put the vendor file back up. Vivian turned on him. Julian, you are disrupting a charity auction. If the charity is honest, it will survive a screen. The technician swallowed, glanced at Malcolm, then at Julian, and obeyed the man whose company name sat at the top of the donor wall. The file reappeared on both massive screens. Donation flows, vendor codes, administrative, transfers, conservation logistics, community support disbursements. The fonts were clean. The labels were soft. The pattern underneath was not. Clara stepped closer to the screen, using the microphone not as a weapon, but as a light. Here, she said, pointing to the first line. A Hawthorne Capital Pledge for emergency housing is divided into 3 smaller payments within 48 hours. Each one falls below the threshold that would normally require additional board review. A trustee near the front sat forward. That cannot be right. Clara moved to the next line. The payments are then routed through PRF Community Support, Northline Community Logistics, and Harbor Renewal Services. Different names, same mailing address on 2 of the forms, and 1 phone number that appears in an old vendor record I have seen before. Malcolm's voice sharpened. You are making assumptions from incomplete information. Then complete it. The challenge landed cleanly. No raised voice, no trembling, just truth placed on a table the entire room could see. Julian stood beside the stage now, close enough for Clara to feel him there, but not blocking her. That mattered. More than he knew. More than she was ready to admit. Vivian tried to laugh, but the sound did not find the room. This is absurd. Clara worked at a small nonprofit. She is not qualified to interpret complex foundation structures. Clara turned toward her. You keep calling things complex when you mean hidden. A few guests looked down. Mrs. Langford stared at the screen, her earlier smile completely gone. One of the Westlake sisters whispered, Is that our pledge? Clara followed the line with her finger. Yes, your family's donation was marked for shelter repairs in the Bronx. It was processed through Harbor Renewal Services, then listed under Event Operations 3 days later. The sister's face changed from embarrassment to alarm. Event Operations? Malcolm stepped in fast. Temporary allocation language. Routine. Clara looked at the old painting, then at the certificate. Routine language does not require a false audit stamp. The room went so still that the distant clink of a server's tray seemed too loud. Clara took a breath, and for 1 second, she was no longer in the St. Aurelia. She was back at a metal desk in a non-profit office years earlier, staring at a grant file that did not make sense while a program director tried not to cry because children were losing after-school hours no one had the money to replace. Back then, Clara had not had a billionaire beside her. She had not had a ballroom, a microphone, or a donor wall. She had only had questions and people powerful enough to ignore them. Tonight, they could not ignore her. The stamp on this certificate does not match the reviewer format, Clara continued. The vendor code links to a structure previously questioned in an unrelated nonprofit funding case. The pledge totals shown tonight do not reconcile with the published donation list. And the final auction item appears to have paperwork that routes fees through the same vendor chain. Malcolm's face had gone pale beneath the stage lights. This is reckless. Julian finally spoke, his voice low but carrying. What is reckless is taking money meant for families and hiding behind language no one at dinner is expected to challenge. Clara looked at him then, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with recognition. He was learning where to stand. Vivian saw it too, and something hard flashed across her face. Julian, you are letting her turn a misunderstanding into a spectacle. Clara answered before he could. No, Vivian. You made me the spectacle when you invited me on stage to stand beside a piece from your past with him. You wanted everyone to watch me feel small. She looked out at the room, at the guests who had laughed when she arrived, at the people who had measured her dress, her family, her education, her place. So watch carefully. She turned back to the screen. Because the woman you called simple just found the money trail. No one laughed now. Not Mrs. Langford. Not the Westlake sisters. Not the donors. Not the reporters. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. Malcolm tried one last time, reaching for the technician station. Take it down. Julian stepped between him and the controls. No, the single word changed the room. Clara lifted the certificate from its stand and placed it beside the microphone. I recommend the auction pause immediately, the foundation preserve every financial record, and an independent review begin before another dollar is pledged tonight. A board member stood slowly, then another. The foundation chair, an older man with a stunned face, looked at Malcolm. Is there an explanation? Malcolm opened his mouth, but no explanation came. Vivian's perfect gala, built to shame Clara Whitfield, had become the exact room where Clara made cruelty look foolish, power look nervous, and every polished guest understand that dignity did not need an invitation to speak. Then Julian looked at the donor screen one more time and saw something Clara had not yet said aloud. One of the questionable transfers had been made under the Hawthorne Capital Matching gift line. The Hawthorne Capital Matching gift line glowed on the screen like a signature Julian had never meant to place on a lie. For the first time that night, the billionaire who could read markets faster than most men read menus looked completely unprepared for what a number could do to his name. The transfer was not large compared to the fortune his company managed, but it did not need to be large. It carried his seal, his donor tier, his corporate trust, and that meant every family promised help under that program had been standing beneath the shadow of his reputation. Clara saw his face change before she saw the line. She followed his eyes, read the entry, and understood why his shoulders went still. Hawthorne Capital Matching gift, routed through PRF Community Support, reclassified under Event Operations. Vivian moved first. That is clearly an administrative error, she said, her voice bright and fast, no longer graceful. Malcolm can explain. Malcolm turned toward her with a look so brief and sharp that only Clara, Julian, and the nearest board member seemed to catch it. Vivian had not defended him. She had offered him to the room. Of course, Malcolm said, recovering. The matching gift line was temporarily coded for processing. Nothing improper occurred. Clara looked at the screen. Then show the original. Restriction letter. Malcolm's mouth tightened. Those records are not immediately available. But the auction certificate was available. The donor deck was available. The pledge totals were available. Only the document that proves where the money was supposed to go is suddenly unavailable. A low murmur moved through the donors. Julian stepped closer to the screen, his voice controlled but colder than Clara had ever heard it. Pull up the Hawthorne grant agreement. Malcolm shook his head. Julian, this is not the proper forum. Julian turned to him. The proper forum became this room the moment my company's name was used to collect money under false clarity. Vivian lifted her chin. You are embarrassing the foundation. Julian looked at her, and something in his expression finally broke away from the past. Not anger exactly. Recognition. No, Vivian. The foundation embarrassed itself when it treated questions like threats. The words landed harder because he had once treated silence as civility. Clara heard that difference. So did Vivian. Her perfect posture stiffened. You are taking her side because you feel guilty. Clara lowered the microphone slightly, but Julian did not look away. I am taking the side of the records. A trustee at the front table called to the technician. Open the email archive attached to the vendor file. Malcolm moved sharply. That requires authorization. The trustee stood. I am authorizing it. Vivian's face changed. Not much. Just enough. Clara saw fear slip beneath the polish. The technician's fingers moved. The screen shifted from spreadsheets to a folder of correspondence. Subject lines appeared one by one. PRF routing clarification, vendor optics, Hawthorne allocation timing, concern from audit consultant. Clara's eyes caught on the last one. Open that, she said. The technician did. The email was dated 6 months earlier. It was addressed to Malcolm Pierce and copied to Vivian Cross. The language was cautious, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. An outside consultant had warned that PRF Community Support, Northline Community Logistics, and Harbor Renewal Services appeared to share overlapping administrative markers and required independent verification before further donor funds were routed through them. Beneath the warning was Vivian's reply, short, polished, devastating. Do not disrupt the Gala structure. Malcolm will manage the optics. No one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they did. Vivian stared at the screen as if betrayal were something the room had done to her by reading her own words. Malcolm stepped back, his careful face finally emptying of confidence. That email is being taken out of context. Clara looked at him. Then add the context. He had none. The foundation chair turned toward the security staff near the wall, then toward legal counsel already moving down the aisle. Mr. Pierce, you are suspended from all foundation duties pending independent review. Preserve every record, every account, every vendor file, and every communication related to tonight's event. Malcolm's lips parted, but no useful sentence came out. Guests who had mocked Clara an hour earlier now watched her like she had become the only stable thing in the ballroom. Mrs. Langford lowered her head. One of the Westlake sisters looked close to tears, not from shame alone, but from realizing her family's donation had been used as decoration for someone else's control. Vivian tried to regain the room one last time. She stepped forward, still beautiful, still silver beneath the lights, still trained to make power sound wounded. I trusted Malcolm with operational details. My focus has always been the children, the families, the mission. Clara turned to her slowly. Then why did you tell him not to disrupt the Gala structure after a consultant warned you about the vendors? Vivian's eyes flashed. You do not understand what it takes to run at this level. I understand exactly what you protected first, Clara said. Not the families, not the donors, the appearance. The silence that followed was not empty. It was judgment. Julian walked to the stage steps and faced the room, not with the charm of a donor, but with the weight of a man finally accepting that his money had been careless where Clara's attention had been precise. Effective. Immediately, Hawthorne Capital is freezing all contributions connected to the Cross Foundation until an independent audit is complete, he said. Vivian turned toward him. Julian, he continued, any portion of Hawthorne funds misdirected from housing support will be replaced directly to verified community programs by tomorrow morning. If other donor funds were affected, Hawthorne Capital will cooperate with the review and support recovery where appropriate. He looked at the donors, then the board, then finally at Clara. His voice softened, but it did not become private. And I owe Clara Whitfield an apology in the same room where I failed her. Clara went still. Julian stood below the stage, not above her, not beside Vivian, not between Clara and the guests, but facing her openly. I brought you here thinking I was making you visible, he said. I thought my presence would be enough. It was not. I let old history, social politeness, and my own pride slow me down while this room tried to make you small. Vivian looked away. The guests did not. Julian's eyes did not leave Clara's. You were never beneath this room. This room was beneath you. Clara held the microphone at her side. Her face calm but her eyes bright with everything she refused to let the Gala own. Applause began somewhere near the back, hesitant at first, then spreading, but Clara did not smile for it. She had not come to be applauded by people who needed evidence before respect. She looked at Julian and understood that he had finally stood where he should have stood earlier. But late truth still had to answer for late courage. As the foundation chair announced that the auction was cancelled, legal counsel began collecting documents, and Vivian's crown of perfect control slipped in front of everyone. Clara stepped down from the stage. Julian reached for her hand, then stopped before touching her. This time he knew permission mattered. Clara looked at his waiting hand, then at the ballroom that had gone silent because of her. Not here, she said softly. Not because they are watching. Then she walked past him toward the exit, leaving Julian under the chandeliers with the apology still in. The air and the hard lesson that defending the woman he loved after the room had wounded her was not the same as protecting her before it began. Outside the St. Aurelia Hotel, the night air felt colder than Clara expected, as if the city had been waiting beyond the gold doors to remind her that silence inside a ballroom did not mean peace outside it. Camera flashes still burst behind the glass. Reporters called her name. Guests spilled into the lobby wearing stunned expressions, clutching evening bags and donor programs now transformed from souvenirs into evidence. Clara did not stop. She walked past the valet stand, past the black cars lined beneath the awning, past the society photographer who had arrived to capture her humiliation and was now trying to photograph her victory. Victory did not feel like the right word. Her hands were steady, but her chest ached with exhaustion. She had silenced the room, yes. She had exposed Malcolm Pierce, forced Vivian Cross into the light, and made the cruelest guests in Manhattan lower their eyes. But none of that erased the moment Julian had smiled politely when Vivian called her brave for entering a room she was never raised to enter. None of it erased the long dinner where he had learned, too slowly, that love could be present and still fail to protect. Behind her, Julian came through the hotel doors without his coat, his tuxedo jacket open, his face stripped of every public mask. Clara, he said. She stopped beside the curb, but did not turn around immediately. A yellow cab passed, spraying rainwater along the gutter. Please, he said, quieter now. Let me take you home. Clara looked back at him. I am going home. You are going back inside. He shook his head. No, yes, because the money trail has your company's name on it, Julian. Because the families those funds were meant to help deserve more than one dramatic apology under chandeliers. Because I do not need you to chase me right now. I need you to fix what your world helped break. The words landed hard, but he did not defend himself. That was new. I will, he said. Clara studied his face beneath the hotel lights. And not because you want me to watch. You do it. He swallowed. Because it is right. She nodded once. Good. Start there. Then she stepped into the cab alone, leaving him under the awning with the kind of loneliness money could not soften. Over the next 3 weeks, Julian did exactly what he should have done before the gala became a courtroom. Hawthorne Capital froze every contribution tied to the Cross Foundation. An independent forensic accounting firm was hired, not by Vivian's board, but by a separate oversight committee with public reporting requirements. Every community program affected by the vendor chain received replacement funding within days. Housing repairs in the Bronx restarted. A youth shelter in Brooklyn received the grant it had been promised. The after-school program Clara remembered from her old nonprofit file was contacted, reviewed, and fully funded through a clean channel with no public ceremony attached. Malcolm Pierce was removed from foundation duties pending legal review. Vivian resigned as gala chair after the consultant email became public, though her statement called the issue an administrative failure, as if language could still polish what truth had already named. Julian did not allow Hawthorne's public relations team to make Clara the face of the cleanup. When a reporter asked whether his fiancée had saved the gala, he answered, Clara Whitfield did not save a gala. She defended the people a gala was supposed to serve. Clara heard the clip while sitting in her small Queens apartment, grading practice essays at her kitchen table with tea cooling beside her and her mother's pearl earrings resting in a dish near the lamp. She turned the volume off before the segment ended. Her phone held 18 messages from Julian, all unanswered except the one she had sent 2 nights after the gala. Do the work first, then we can talk. He did the work. Still, work was not the same as trust. On a Saturday afternoon, Clara attended a fundraiser at a community school in Queens, the kind of event with folding chairs, paper banners, cafeteria coffee, and volunteers carrying trays of cookies wrapped in plastic. No chandeliers. No society photographers. No women in silver gowns, smiling like knives. The fundraiser supported housing stability programs and classroom supplies for children whose families had been one emergency away from losing both. Clara wore a simple green dress and her pearl earrings. She was arranging donation forms at a check-in table when the room quieted slightly. She looked up and saw Julian at the entrance. Not in a tuxedo, not surrounded by aides, just Julian in a navy suit without a tie, holding a cardboard box of donated winter coats with both hands. For once, he did not look like the most powerful man in the room. He looked like a man asking where he could be useful. A volunteer pointed him toward a storage table, and he went without searching for Clara first. She watched him fold coats, tape labels on boxes, carry chairs, and listen when the school director explained which families needed immediate rental support. He did not step onto the small stage. He did not give a speech. When a donor tried to praise his generosity loudly, Julian said, Please thank the staff. They know what is needed better than I do. Clara felt something in her chest loosen, not enough to heal, but enough to breathe. Near the end of the event, she found him in the hallway stacking empty supply bins. Children's artwork lined the walls. Rain tapped gently against the windows. He looked up when she approached, and for a second, the hallway held everything they had not said. You came, Clara said. You told me to do the work first. I did. I am still doing it. She nodded. I know. He looked at her earrings, then quickly back to her eyes, careful not to turn memory into a symbol before she offered it. I am sorry, he said. Not for being late with a grand apology. For being late when it mattered quietly. At the first insult. At the first pause. At the first moment you had to stand alone in a room where I had promised you would not. Clara's eyes shone, but her voice stayed steady. You waited until I was bleeding with dignity before you stood beside me. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, accepting the wound without argument. I know. Do you? Yes, he said. Because now I understand that standing beside you is not a photograph. It is a responsibility. Clara looked through the open cafeteria doors. Volunteers were laughing as they cleaned tables. A little girl carried a box of crayons almost too large for her arms. The world was smaller here than the St. Aurelia, but it felt more honest. Julian stepped aside as people passed, making room without being asked. Clara noticed. He did not ask for the ring. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask whether they were all right. He only waited. Finally, Clara held out a stack of donation forms. These need to go to the front table. Julian took them. Of course. She began walking, and this time he did not move ahead of her. He matched her pace, a half step beside her, close enough to help, not close enough to crowd. At the cafeteria doorway, Clara paused and looked at him. Now you are learning where to stand. His expression softened with relief. He did not try to turn into triumph. I will keep learning. Clara did not promise him forever that day. She did not let the world rush her heart because it loved a neat ending. But when they stepped back into the warm noise of the fundraiser, she let his hand brush hers. Then slowly, deliberately, she held it. Not for the cameras. Not for the guests. Not to prove anything to a room. Only because trust, once broken by silence, could begin again in the quiet place where love finally learned to act.